If you're interested in hearing history from perspectives rarely told, please consider subscribing. These stories require deep research into primary sources, war diaries, and personal testimonies to bring you the unfiltered human experience of war from all sides. This account is reconstructed from fragmentary records, survivor testimonies, and post-war interviews with members of the Hitler Youth and Volkssturm who fought in the Battle of Berlin in April and May of 1945. The narrative follows the experiences of 16-year-old Georg Hoffman, a Hitler Youth member conscripted into the defense of Berlin during the final days of the Third Reich. Details have been drawn from multiple sources, including the diary fragments of young defenders found in the ruins of Berlin, Soviet military reports, German civilian testimonies collected by the Allies after the war, and interviews with the few teenage soldiers who survived the battle. What follows is the story of a boy forced to become a soldier who watched his world collapse in fire and blood and who experienced horrors that no child should ever witness. Georg Hoffman stood on the platform of Anhalter Bahnhof railway station in Berlin on April 20th, 1945, and tried not to vomit. Around him, dozens of other boys wearing oversized Wehrmacht uniforms shuffled and fidgeted, their faces pale in the dim light filtering through the bomb-damaged roof. Georg was 16 years old. 3 weeks ago, he had been attending classes and worrying about mathematics examinations. Now he wore a uniform that smelled like the previous owner had died in it, which he probably had, and clutched a Karabiner 98 rifle that was almost as tall as he was. The train had arrived from the suburbs 2 hours earlier, packed with boys aged 14 to 17, all summoned by notices delivered to their homes by Hitler Youth leaders. The notice Georg received had been brief and terrifying. You are called to defend the Reich in its hour of greatest need. Report to your local assembly point immediately. Failure to comply will result in arrest and execution as a traitor. His mother had cried when he left. His father had been killed on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. His older brother had died at Stalingrad. Now Georg was all she had left, and the Reich was taking him too. An SS officer walked along the platform, his boots clicking on the concrete. He was older, maybe 30, with a scar running down his left cheek and eyes that looked through the boys rather than at them. "You are the fortunate generation," he announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous station. "You have been chosen to defend our Führer and our capital in the final battle against Bolshevism. The enemy is at our gates, but with courage and sacrifice we will turn them back. The Führer himself has called for you. The Führer believes in you. You will not let him down." Georg looked at the boy standing next to him. His name was Peter. They had been in the same Hitler Youth unit for 3 years. Peter was 15, small for his age, with thick glasses that made his eyes look enormous. His hands were shaking so badly that the rifle he held was vibrating visibly. Georg wanted to say something reassuring, something that would make them both feel less terrified, but he couldn't find any words. What could he say? That everything would be all right? That they would survive? He didn't believe it himself. The SS officer continued his speech, but Georg stopped listening. He was thinking about the journey into the city. From the train windows he had watched Berlin burn, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Buildings that had stood for centuries now, just skeletal frames against the smoke-filled sky. Bodies in the streets, some covered with sheets, others just left where they had fallen. The smell had seeped into the train carriages, a mixture of burning wood, cordite, and something sweet and rotten that Georg's mind refused to identify even though he knew exactly what it was. They had passed through neighborhoods Georg recognized from school trips and family outings, except now they were unrecognizable. The zoo was destroyed. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church was a hollow shell. Unter den Linden, the grand boulevard where Georg had once walked with his father to see the Christmas markets, was a landscape of craters and shattered buildings, and everywhere the sound of artillery. A constant rumbling that made the train shake and made Georg's teeth hurt from clenching his jaw. "You will be assigned to defensive positions throughout the city," the SS officer was saying. "Some of you will man anti-tank weapons. Others will serve as infantry in support of regular Wehrmacht units. You have been trained for this moment. You know your duty. Remember, behind you are your mothers, your sisters, your homes. If we fail here, they will suffer the revenge of the Bolsheviks. You are their last protection." Georg thought about the training he had received. 3 days. 3 days of being shown how to load and fire the rifle, how to throw a grenade, how to use a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. The instructors had been frantic, shouting constantly, hitting boys who were too slow or too clumsy. There had been no time for practice. No time for anything except the bare minimum needed to make them marginally less useless as soldiers. Georg had fired his rifle exactly 6 times. He had thrown 1 practice grenade. He had never fired a Panzerfaust at all, just been shown how the trigger mechanism worked. The boys were divided into groups of 20 and assigned to different trucks. Georg and Peter ended up in the same group, along with 18 others whose faces all showed the same expression of barely controlled panic. The truck had no roof, just a canvas cover that had been torn away by shrapnel. As they drove through the burning city, Georg could see everything: buildings collapsing, people running with whatever possessions they could carry, wounded soldiers being carried on stretchers, and bodies, so many bodies. They passed a square where Soviet artillery had caught a group of civilians trying to flee. Georg saw a woman's body, still clutching a small child. He saw an elderly man sitting against a wall, his head tilted at an impossible angle. He saw things that his 16-year-old mind tried to reject, tried to unsee, but couldn't. Peter leaned over the side of the truck and vomited. Several other boys did the same. The SS officer riding in the front of the truck didn't even turn around. The truck stopped in a neighborhood called Prenzlauer Berg, or what was left of it. Georg had never been to this part of Berlin before. Now he wished he never had. The streets were narrow canyons of destruction, buildings leaning at crazy angles, some already collapsed into mountains of brick and twisted metal. The air was thick with dust and smoke that made his eyes water and his throat burn. Somewhere close by, machine guns rattled in short bursts. Somewhere even closer, someone was screaming. "Out! Everyone out!" barked the SS officer. The boys scrambled from the truck, stumbling over each other in their haste. Georg's legs had gone numb from the ride, and he nearly fell. Peter caught his arm, steadying him. They stood in a ragged group on the rubble-strewn street while the SS officer conferred with a Wehrmacht sergeant who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The sergeant's uniform was filthy, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood. When he looked at the boys, his expression was one of pure despair. "These are children," the sergeant said to the SS officer, not bothering to lower his voice. "These are goddamn children. What am I supposed to do with children?" The SS officer's face hardened. "You are supposed to use them to defend this position. Those are your orders. The Führer has decreed that every German capable of bearing arms will fight. Age is irrelevant." The sergeant stared at him for a long moment, then spat on the ground. "The Führer is insane." We're all going to die here." The SS officer's hand moved to his pistol. "Say that again, and I'll shoot you where you stand." The sergeant held his gaze, then looked away. "Fine. I'll take them, but their blood is on your hands, not mine." The SS officer left in the truck, presumably to collect more boys to feed into the meat grinder. The sergeant turned to Georg's group and rubbed his face with both hands. "All right, listen to me. The Russians are 3 blocks that way." He pointed east. "They're coming slowly because we're making them pay for every meter. But they're coming. They have tanks, artillery, and about 1 million soldiers. We have you." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness. "I'm Sergeant Wolf. I've been fighting since Poland in '39. I'm going to try to keep you alive, but I'm not making any promises." Wolf led them through the ruins to what he called a defensive position. It was a barricade constructed from furniture, cobblestones, and parts of destroyed vehicles stretched across a street between 2 partially collapsed buildings. Behind the barricade, a handful of Wehrmacht soldiers sat smoking and staring at nothing. They looked up as the boys approached. One of them, a man in his 40s with gray hair and only one arm, started laughing. "Oh, Jesus! Oh, Jesus Christ! They're sending us children now. We're finished. We're completely finished." Wolf ignored him and positioned the boys along the barricade. "You'll work in pairs. One man fires while the other loads and spots. When the Russians come, and they will come, you aim for the center of mass. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try for headshots. Just point and shoot until they stop coming or you run out of ammunition." He paused, looking at their terrified faces. "If you get hit, scream for a medic. If your partner gets hit and he's still alive, drag him back to the aid station in the cellar of that building behind us. If he's dead, leave him and keep fighting. Does everyone understand?" No one answered. They were all staring at the street ahead, at the rubble and the darkness and the unknown horror that was coming for them. Georg found himself positioned next to Peter. They crouched behind an overturned car that had been incorporated into the barricade. Peter was shaking so badly his glasses kept sliding down his nose. "I can't do this," Peter whispered. "Georg, I can't do this. I want my mother. I want to go home." Georg gripped his friend's shoulder. "We don't have a choice. We just have to get through today. Just today. Tomorrow maybe the war will be over." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The afternoon dragged on in terrible anticipation. The boys sat behind their barricade and listened to the sounds of battle growing closer. Artillery shells screamed overhead, some landing blocks away, others close enough that the explosions showered them with debris. Georg watched the older soldiers and tried to learn from them. They stayed low. They didn't waste movement. They smoked constantly, lighting new cigarettes from the butts of old ones. One of them, a corporal named Steiner who couldn't have been more than 25, came over and showed Georg and Peter how to properly brace the rifle against their shoulders. "If you don't hold it tight, the recoil will bruise you. Hold it firm, breathe steady. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull." He demonstrated, then made them practice the motion without firing. His hands were gentle, his voice patient. He treated them like students, not soldiers. Georg felt absurdly grateful. At 4 in the afternoon, a runner came scrambling through the ruins. He was another boy, maybe 14, his face blackened with soot. "They're coming," he gasped. "34s. Infantry. Lots of infantry. 5 minutes." Then he was gone, sprinting to the next position to deliver the same message. Wolf stood up and walked along the barricade. "This is it. Remember what I taught you. low and steady. Make your shots count, and whatever you do, don't run. If you run, you'll die tired." He took his position at the center of the barricade and chambered a round in his rifle. Georg's hands were sweating so badly he could barely hold his weapon. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. His mouth was completely dry. Beside him, Peter was crying silently, tears running down his cheeks, but he had his rifle up and pointed down the street. Georg wanted to cry too. He wanted to scream. He wanted to be anywhere else in the world, but he stayed where he was because there was nowhere else to go. The first Soviet soldiers appeared at the end of the street. Georg could see them moving from cover to cover, advancing in coordinated groups. They moved professionally, efficiently, like men who had done this 1,000 times before. Behind them, he heard the rumble of tank engines. "Here they come," someone shouted. The Wehrmacht soldiers opened fire. Georg aimed at a shape moving between two piles of rubble and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, exactly as Steiner had warned. He had no idea if he hit anything. Peter fired beside him, worked the bolt, fired again. The Soviet soldiers returned fire, and the air filled with the crack of bullets passing overhead. A bullet struck the overturned car they were hiding behind, and Georg felt the impact vibrate through the metal. Another bullet hit the cobblestones and sent stone fragments spraying into his face. One cut his cheek, and he felt warm blood running down to his jaw. He worked the bolt on his rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge, chambering a new round. His hands moved on autopilot, while his mind seemed to float somewhere above his body, watching this terrified boy pretending to be a soldier. He fired again, and again. The rifle became hot in his hands. The smell of gunpowder was overwhelming. To his left, one of the Wehrmacht soldiers stood up to get a better shot, and his head snapped back violently. He collapsed behind the barricade without making a sound. Georg saw the entry wound, a small hole in his forehead, and the much larger exit wound in the back of his skull. He saw the man's eyes, still open, still staring at nothing. He saw brain matter on the rubble behind where the man had been standing. Georg turned away and vomited, his stomach heaving even though there was nothing left to bring up. "Tank!" someone screamed. Georg looked up and saw the T-34 rolling down the street toward them, its treads crushing rubble, its gun traversing to aim at the barricade. Steiner grabbed a Panzerfaust from the pile of weapons and ran forward to get a clear shot. The tank's machine gun opened fire, and Steiner's body jerked as bullets tore through him. He fell forward, the Panzerfaust clattering from his hands unfired. The tank kept coming. Its main gun fired, and the explosion lifted part of the barricade into the air. Georg felt the shockwave slam into his chest. His ears rang so loudly he couldn't hear anything else. When his vision cleared, he saw that half their position was simply gone. The furniture and cobblestones and metal that had formed their protection were scattered across the street. Bodies were scattered with them. The one armed soldier who had laughed at them earlier was lying on his back, his remaining arm reaching toward the sky, his chest a red ruin. Two of the boys from Georg's group were dead, their bodies twisted at impossible angles. Another boy, Georg didn't know his name, sat against a wall holding his stomach while his intestines bulged between his fingers. He was making a high keening sound like an animal caught in a trap. "Fall back," Wolf was shouting. "Fall back to the secondary position." The surviving defenders scrambled away from the barricade, running hunched over through the ruins toward the building that housed the aid station. Georg grabbed Peter's arm and pulled him along. They ran together, stumbling over debris while bullets kicked up dust around their feet. They made it to the building's entrance and threw themselves down the stairs into the cellar. The aid station was a vision of hell. Wounded men lay on every available surface. The floor was slick with blood. A doctor who looked like he was about 70 years old moved from patient to patient, doing what he could with almost no supplies. His apron was so blood-soaked it was completely red. A nurse, her face gray with exhaustion, was trying to bandage a soldier whose leg had been blown off below the knee. The soldier was screaming, begging her to save his leg, not understanding that it was already gone. Georg and Peter pressed themselves against the wall, trying to stay out of the way. More defenders crowded into the cellar. Wolf appeared, blood running from a cut on his scalp. He was carrying a boy over his shoulder, one of Georg's group. The boy's name was Hans. He had been joking that morning about a girl he liked. Now his face was white as paper, and his shirt was soaked with blood from a wound in his side. Wolf laid him gently on the floor. The doctor glanced at him, then shook his head and moved on to someone he might be able to save. Hans looked up at Georg and Peter. "Am I going to be okay?" His voice was a whisper. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. Georg knelt beside him and took his hand. "Yes, you're going to be fine. The doctor will fix you up." Hans's grip was weak. "I'm cold. Why am I so cold?" Georg took off his jacket and laid it over Hans's chest. Just rest now." Hans stared at the ceiling. His breathing became shallow and rapid, then it stopped. His hand went limp in Georg's grip. He was dead. 15 years old and dead in a cellar in Berlin while the city burned above him. Peter was sobbing now, great gasping sobs that shook his whole body. Georg put his arm around his friend's shoulders and held him. Around them, men were dying. The smell of blood and excrement and fear was suffocating. The building shook as shells landed nearby. Dust fell from the ceiling. Someone was praying in Russian. Georg realized with a shock that Soviet soldiers must have captured the upper floors. They were trapped. Wolf gathered the surviving defenders. There were perhaps 20 men and boys left from a force that had numbered over 60 that morning. "We're cut off," he said bluntly. "The Russians are upstairs. We can try to fight our way out, or we can surrender. I'm not ordering anyone to die. You've done enough. You've all done more than enough." He looked at the boys specifically. "You children especially. No one can say you didn't do your duty. If you want to surrender, I won't stop you." The one armed soldier laughed that bitter laugh again. "Surrender to the Russians? After what we did on the Eastern Front? They'll shoot us all." Wolf shrugged. "Maybe. But staying here means dying for certain when they throw grenades down those stairs. I'm surrendering. Anyone who wants to join me can." He threw down his rifle and raised his hands above his head. Slowly, one by one, the others did the same. Georg looked at Peter. Peter looked back at him. They had no choice. They had never had any choice. They dropped their rifles and raised their hands. Soviet soldiers came down the stairs cautiously, weapons ready. They were young men, not much older than Georg, wearing brown uniforms and carrying PPS submachine guns. They shouted in Russian, gesturing for everyone to move against the wall. The Germans complied. One Soviet soldier walked along the line, looking at each prisoner. When he saw Georg and Peter, his expression changed from anger to something like pity. He said something in Russian, shaking his head. Georg didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "You're just children." What were they thinking? Sending children? The prisoners were marched out of the building into a street now fully controlled by Soviet forces. Tanks rolled past. Infantry moved in organized columns. The battle was moving west, deeper into Berlin. Georg looked back at the ruined building where Hans and Steiner and so many others lay dead. He had survived. He didn't know why. He didn't know if survival was a gift or a curse. He was 16 years old and had killed men whose faces he couldn't remember. He had watched his friends die. He had seen things that would replay in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The prisoners were loaded into trucks and driven east, away from the dying city. Georg sat between Peter and an older soldier who stared at nothing and said nothing. As the truck drove through the ruins, Georg could still hear the sounds of battle. The war was ending. Germany was dying. And Georg Hoffman, who 3 weeks ago had been worried about mathematics examinations, was going to a Soviet prisoner of war camp with blood on his hands and ghosts in his head. Georg Hoffman spent 4 years in Soviet captivity. He was released in 1949 and returned to Berlin to find his mother had died during the final battle, killed by artillery fire while sheltering in a basement. He never spoke about his time as a soldier, not even to his wife or children. He worked as a postal clerk for 30 years, living a quiet, unremarkable life. He died in 1992 at the age of 63 from heart failure. His medical records noted that he suffered from severe nightmares and anxiety throughout his adult life, conditions that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Peter survived the war as well. He and Georg exchanged letters occasionally over the years, but never met in person. Neither could bear to see the other and remember what they had witnessed together. Peter became a teacher and spent his career working with children, trying perhaps to give them the childhood that had been stolen from him. He died in 2003. The Battle of Berlin claimed the lives of approximately 100,000 German soldiers and civilians. Among them were thousands of boys aged 14 to 17, conscripted in the final desperate days of the Third Reich and thrown into combat with minimal training and no hope of survival. Their names are largely forgotten. Their stories rarely told. They were children asked to fight an adult's war, to die for a regime that had already lost, to sacrifice themselves for leaders who viewed them as expendable. This is their memorial. This is their story. May we never forget the cost of sending children to war. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe. These accounts matter because they remind us that every war, regardless of cause or side, is ultimately measured in human lives and human suffering. Understanding these perspectives helps ensure we never repeat the mistakes of the past.